So I just wanted to share a little bit about follow up from the last discussion about NPM packages.
That's not going to work.
No, I can't quote Lloyd. Fortunately, this is all I have to do. No, it's not all I have to do. Ha, I got it right this time. Okay, so we have a registry of implementation guides where you can... No, it turns out I do need to do some more. What a horrible... Lloyd turns his trackpad off. Drives me nuts. Are you interested in seeing what IHE has published?
Why would we care about IHE?
Oh, well, in that case, we won't care. Or we can say we're interested in payment summary. Let's see what we find. Anyway, so this list has all of the implementation guides that IHE or HL7 has published. Are you current?
Yeah.
Yep, you're current. Okay. And it also has implementation guides from several affiliates, but only some affiliates. This page you're looking at is actually built from... It turns out I do need to go to the bottom of the page. How do you do this? How do you get... It's a foreign keyboard. It's really foreign.
It's a horrible keyboard because the regular keyboard is dead.
It's more the... Yeah, never mind.
It's only slightly better than the dead one.
So this is built from a JSON file. Yes, you can make it bigger. Which is a processable list of all implementation guides, along with a bunch of information about them, including some textual description for them. The textual description comes from the IG proposal. That's why we have the IG proposal, so that we can fill this registry out.
One of the reasons.
That's one of the reasons, yes. So we can fill out this. So this is a list. So if ever you decide that you want to actually write some code that processes implementation guides, this is the place to start. It lists every implementation guide and where it can be found. And then the canonical URL points to a package list.json file which tells you every version that was ever published and where that can be found, and then where the package, the NPM package, can be found and where the HTML can be found. So from this package file, JSON file, the entire ecosystem is available to you and to any tools. Okay, so, and this is all automatically, there's one other JSON file which I'll show you in a second. And so there's two JSON files, which are the master. This is the master of formally published implementation guides. And then there's the JSON file for current builds. So here, Lloyd, you could do this. It's your keyboard. How do we get to the current list of auto build current builds? On my this is my homepage on my browser. Now I've got to get you to do this.
Yeah, I don't remember where I stuck it. I don't go there that often.
So there used to be a link at the bottom.
Actually, maybe it's your work.
On the FHIR.org that had implementation guide registry, and now the one very bottom.
It's broken. It's killing me that it's broken.
Yeah, that's where I always went.
Yeah. So actually, it's an internal redirect issue in the server. If you go to /guide/registry/ it works. If you go to /guide/registry without the second slash, it redirects you off to somewhere that no one understands why, and we can't get good support on it. So behind this file, which is automatically maintained by the build CI, the CI build, which, as I said, is my homepage, is another JSON file, which is a list of all the guides that have been through the CI build, along with their GitHub source and where they went when they were built, and some other information about them. So what that means is from those two files, the entire ecosystem is laid out and available, and that's how all the tools find all the implementation guides from one of those two files.
So everybody in the world can see what you were doing in this class.
Well, yeah.
If they know where to look.
So I just, and so you don't need to do anything to make this happen except for this other file, this file here, the publication tooling. So there's a little adjunct piece of tooling in the IG publisher that Lynn and I use, which actually publishes, right? So all you just do a build and you get left with the candidate publishing file. We actually publish that to the HL7 website or the FHIR.org website with this extra code that knows how to turn what you generated into what is ready to be published in a maintained directory. And when that code runs, it also does the changes that are needed to this file and commits this file to, or then we commit this file to GitHub. So IHE would want to move to a similar system so you don't have to maintain this by hand. So that's work in progress. I'll sit down with you at some stage and go through how IHE would do that. But if you are otherwise publishing through some other route than through HL7 or FHIR, then you might want to have a think about reusing our same publication framework for the post-processing and the actual milestone publication on a website. And if you want to do that, we can talk about that. But you don't have to. You can do whatever you want.
When you were showing that other page with search, the actual UI,
Yep.
is that searching just on the name?
No. This is like a trap, Lloyd. It's like grabbing victory from the claws of defeat or something. No, defeat from the claws of victory. No, the search there searches the name and the description, the short description from the original definition. So, for instance, national. I can't spell for peanuts. No, that didn't match anything. National.
If it was the other keyboard, you wouldn't be able to type keys.
So you see it matched on the title, on the description as well as the title.
Have you thought about keyword?
Well, it's an ongoing discussion. We do have a category here. One of the things, Lynn and I make up the categories, which means pretty much that I do it. And you can see one we haven't actually categorized yet because I haven't got around to doing that. It's on my to-do list. I don't know which one that is. That didn't work. Anyway, but if you all want to look at your implementation guides and the description and the categorization and enter into discussion with me, that would be great. Because it's kind of tiresome to try and figure out categorizations. But feedback from the users is they like that feature a lot.
But ONC's proving ground allows you to put the keys, and that's really useful for searchers.
I believe that I have a reference to the proving ground here. No, it doesn't look like I do. I thought I did. But honestly, ONC have a bigger budget than I do. So I haven't figured that stuff out yet. Any questions about all this? And we'll get back to other stuff. No questions? Cool.
So this IG has a bunch of assertions around good practice. Some of them that we talked about were already here. Some of them will be added soon. And there's a bunch of ones that we did not talk about. I want to chat about a few of them. And of course, my hope / expectation is that we will get the community involved in this page. We will see pull requests and discussion on chat.fhir.org around these and add more and improve language and debate whether some of them are true or not, and maybe refine the context in which that they are relevant, etc. Some of them we've talked about, not in the specific section, but just more generally, things like you could define 2,000 artifacts in your IG. That's possible, and some projects will have the bandwidth to do that. but you also need to think about your implementer community and your review community, like the ballot pool. Are they going to have a hope of actually looking at all of those and evaluating them meaningfully and implementing them? And the answer in most cases is probably no. So think about what you produce in terms of what the community that you're targeting can reasonably consume, and consume at one time. Maybe eventually you'll get to 2,000 artifacts, but that's probably not what you want to go out to them with initially. So release your IG with chunks of functionality that is useful and consumable and reviewable by the people that you're targeting. Wanted to
You mean broadly, right? So it's like profiles.
profiles, value sets,
mapping.
capability statements, etc. Every single computable thing that you produce, in principle, needs to be reviewed and presumably needs to be implemented, because if it's not being implemented, why are you wasting your time? I mean, you could produce mappings for all sorts of wonderful things because it's entertaining, and some people actually are entertained by that. But if you're going to include it in the implementation guide, it should be because you expect software developers, analysts, people who you're targeting with the implementation guide to use that in production, or to use it to guide what they're putting into production. And therefore, they need to be able to consume and understand what it is that you're throwing at them. Another thing I want to talk about is being really cautious around constraints generally. There's lots of people who will throw in constraints that say things like you must have a birth date, or the birth date needs to be at least this old, or all sorts of other things. And those make really good sense as business rules, and you can have all kinds of business rules in your systems about what data you're willing to accept and what you're not. But the thing with business rules is that they're easy to adjust. So if you find that you're now talking to a partner who doesn't have deceased date, or has some wonky deceased dates that they really have no ability to clean up, you can massage your business rules if you decide that you really want that data and let that data in. What you put into the implementation guide is really locked. It's what people are being tested against for conformance, and if the business rules in the implementation guide say this isn't allowed, then it's not allowed, period, whether it makes sense in a particular context or not. So people will initially want to put every single business rule that they have into the implementation guide because that will improve their data quality, so they think. But it's not necessarily going to impose their wishes on reality. And quite often, being able to accept real data is going to be more important than having tight filters. So think about what should be a business rule versus what actually has to live at the implementation guide level. Other thing to think about is one of the common things that people do, and Graham talked about this briefly, is they go through and they say, I don't care about that max occurs 0, I don't care about that max occurs 0, I only accept one patient name, max occurs 1, etc. That's an easy thing to do in tools like Forge or Trifolia or other tools, and it's an instinctual thing for people who are used to creating specifications that tighten it down to only what I want. And in some environments, that might be an appropriate thing to do, but in the FHIR space, what we are typically wanting to do is to define interfaces such that I can send the data that I have to anybody who needs to receive it. So if I have 5 names and I have a recipient who might like to receive all of those 5 names, my preference is I create one interface that exposes the data that I have, and I send that to everyone. And if somebody only wants one name, it's their job to figure out which of the names that I have that they want to receive. So better behavior when defining a profile is, instead of saying you must only have one name, is to instead say there needs to be at least one name that has a use of official and doesn't have an end date, because we think that that's a reasonable constraint that a person should only have one official current name. And if that turns out to not be true, that people can have multiple simultaneous official names, then maybe you need to throw an extension on that differentiates the official name that you care about from the other official names that they have. And so you can tighten down and say, this is the specific name that I care about, and you can require your communication partners to declare the extension that lets you find that piece of information, but they can then put that extension in their interface and send all of their names. One of them will have that extension on it to everyone. Most people will not care about the extension and will ignore it and have the names that they care about, but you can extract the one that you particularly need. If you choose to not do things that way, you choose to say, I want you to give me only one name, then that means that anybody who's talking to you has to create a specific interface for your system that filters out the name that you want, and they will be maintaining forevermore an interface that's targeted at your specific system. And there will be situations where that's necessary because there is a legal requirement or whatever that prohibits sharing extra information with this system, and you can't enforce that sufficiently through the typical privacy controls or whatever that you control information sharing generally. And you will have to have a custom interface to talk to those particular clients. But there's a cost to that. And if there isn't a legal requirement for it, and you can easily ignore the data that you don't care about, and you can define how to extract the piece of data that you do care about, that reduces the overall costs for the community and is generally something that is a better thing to do. Graham's about to talk to say, but if I'm talking about what I'm actually going to pay attention to, and I want to mark as 0 the things that I'm not going to pay attention to, or he might not be saying that, you can do that with must support. So if there's stuff that, generally speaking, if you set max occurs to 0, that's saying it's an error if this data is present. If you leave it as max occurs equals whatever, but must support equals false, you're saying it's okay if this data is present, but I'm not going to do anything useful with it. So if you send it to me, I'm probably going to throw it on the floor, and don't get mad because I threw it on the floor. So that's the differentiator, is if max occurs 0 says this is an error, and furthermore it's an error now and forever if you're locked into backward compatibility rules, whereas must support equals false says right now I'm not doing anything with this. In the future I might decide to do something with it, and if that's the case then I'll change must support.
Actually, I was going to say something different. When you sit down with business people, business analysts, clinicians, they're very often focused on the happy path, and they'll tell you that something is mandatory. You must have it. Absolutely, everything's got it. And it turns out that that's just not true. And there's all the edge cases, which we all hate, which drive, our behaviour. And so things that they wanted to be mandatory can't be. So I just wanted to point out that there's a second option, which is that you can define best practice profiles. Say, okay, here's the minimum rules. If you have to meet these rules. But actually these rules are pretty lenient because of the stick and edge cases. But there is a possibility to define a best practice implementation guide or profile and say, if you're doing best practice, then here's the rules. And then you can run the validator in best practice mode, where it actually enforces the best practice rules as errors.
And
or
that's
you can
actually
run it in ignore the best practice rules because I just can't. And so then there's a kind of a virtuous circle where people can claim that they're best practice. So it's an option for when you're writing an implementation guide to give people a best practice level to aim at if you can't just write the rules.
Yeah, so that's actually not a separate profile. That's a type of constraint. So when you define constraints or invariants using FHIR path to say you must have a name or a date of birth, you can create those and you can say that they are error level. So if this is not true, it's an error. You can define them as warning, which says if this is not true, it's a warning, which means have a human go to look at it because it might be an error. Or you can define it as a best practice, which means that it's not an error if it's not true, but we're not going to give you a smiley face sticker if it's not true. And yeah, that is a useful way of diffusing some of the conversations of, but we really want to make people do this, even though we accept that the existing data that they have that we want them to share with us isn't going to do it. Is you can give them the smiley face when they do it, and maybe even throw incentives at those who manage to meet the smiley face situation, but still allow the data to flow that you need to flow. Was there a hand?
Well, I'm kind of wanting to split the difference because I've done IGs where there is two different I've done, so like MHD has in it two different conformance profiles, one for the strict XDS set of rules and one for the minimal metadata. So I did do that, and when you said that, I'm like, wait a minute, is there a way to tag one of those as just best case and one of those as minimal must conform? And I didn't know.
Well, it turns out there is, but we haven't fully run that through everything. So Lloyd's right that there's best practice invariance, but there's also best practice bindings between capability statements and profiles, but that's not, we haven't sort of talked about that a lot. But that's also, I think, we need to sort.
Cool. I got a use case we can play with.
Yeah. One other pet one for me. For those who are working on implementation guides that have overlap with the version 3 space, which in the US typically means CDA, you will encounter systems that have a unique way of representing code systems and a unique way of representing identifier systems. And in version 3, the way you had to do that was using OIDs. And it is possible in FHIR to just take that OID, slap a URN colon OID colon on the front of it, and it becomes a valid URN. And implementers look at that and go, cool, then I don't have to change anything. And that's true, but it results in imposing a long-term ongoing cost to the community. OIDs suck. OIDs do not resolve. You can't take an OID and plop it into a browser and have any hope of looking up what the codes are. Actually, many of them do. And at least they're human readable, so you can understand what the heck they're talking about. They're much less likely to have transposition issues where you get the number wrong, and because it's not human readable, nobody has a clue that it's wrong, and it goes into production, and you realize you've been using the wrong OID for 2 years, and then you have all sorts of data problems. When you go to somebody, you need to talk to them about a need for a system. Nobody knows what an OID is, and you're going to waste several days trying to explain to them what OIDs are and why you need one. Most systems understand the notion of what a URL is, and some of them even understand what the notion of a permalink is, and it's a much easier conversation to have. But most importantly, it's much easier for your software developers and those who need to debug systems if when they're looking at the data, they see something that makes sense to them. And 2.16.385.whatever is not something that software developers really want to deal with on a regular basis, whereas http://loink.org or nomed.info/sct or myhealth.org/identifiers/mrn is much, much easier to understand and work with. So we have a resource in FHIR called naming system that allows you to maintain the linkage that says this OID corresponds to this URL. And by the way, there are actually 3 different OIDs that have been used historically for this. This is the preferred one when you're going back and forth. And so you can do that transformation relatively painlessly. And there's a way to share those. And if you choose to not implement that transformation process, then you're pretty much stuck there. Because once you decide that the way that we're going to identify this code system is with URN:OID: something. It's going to be that way in FHIR for the next 30, 40 years. This is
Example of how to do this?
of how to use naming system to convert between the two. I mean, I can show you what naming system looks like. Yeah. So naming system lets you capture metadata about the thing it is. So this is a code system. You could capture what jurisdiction it was associated with, etc. Pardon me? Control plus. All right. And the unique IDs for this particular naming system are, here's the OID, here's the URI. And you can, this one doesn't have a preferred tag beside the OID. It could. You could actually have 3 different OIDs, one of which has a preferred tag beside it. So you can maintain this, you can share this. There's metadata on this, so you can do things like show me all of the driver's licenses for Australia. And it will give you everything that is categorized as being a driver's license for the jurisdiction of Australia and show you what the OIDs and the URLs are for that.
Does it tell you if this is a code system or a value set or what's
So we only use these for code systems and naming systems. We don't use it for value sets. The value sets themselves allow you to capture other identifiers. So if you have a formal representation of a value set, you can capture what the OID for it is on the value set resource. But this is for situations, quite often we have lots of code systems where we don't know anything about the content of the code system. We just want to be able to convert the identifiers. So strongly encourage your implementation space to not take the easy way of just throwing a URN:OID on the front and keeping OIDs in, but look at this as an opportunity to move to something that's going to be more implementer friendly.
So how would I know if I wanted to do this with the OID that's been used for NPI?
Mm-hmm.
How would I know if other people have already solved this problem so that my IG doesn't solve it one way when another?
So we do have in the core specification on the terminologies page a list of identifier systems. And for these identifier systems, which cover a variety of things, so for example, US Social Security number, a lot of them are US specific because US has way too much influence over HL7. I'll say that as a Canadian. So we absolutely have the ability to accept registration of more. The new UTG, Unified Terminology Governance process, in addition to letting you submit proposals for new code systems and new value sets, will also let you submit proposals for new naming systems. And so this is something that will span HL7's V2, V3 FHIR world. You'll be able to submit these and get them approved, and the expectation is people will need to use them. So there's a whole whack of other guidance in there, and I promised that I would tell you where it is.
So would you need to put this naming system artifact in your own IG? Would you need to put this naming system artifact in your own IG, or do you just assume that the community knows all this stuff already?
You've got 2 choices. You can put the naming system in through the UTG process. So if it's something that is of broad interest to the community at large, like the name of a national identifier or statewide identifier that most people are going to care about, just register it through HL7. On the other hand, if it is Hospital XYZ's lab requisition number, We probably don't want those in being submitted to HL7 because it would drive Ted crazy.
You don't want those really in your IG.
No, I mean, well, it depends. Depends on the scope of the IG. So there will be IGs that are pretty narrow in scope where something like that could make good sense. And so for HL7 International, probably most of the time we'll just stick them into the international registry because that's going to be the place that makes sense for them to live. But for people who are defining narrower scope IGs, it could make a lot of sense for them to just define a bunch of naming systems inside their IG.
If I can clarify, if it's defined on that page that you just showed, then you don't need to do anything in your own IG to make that link. It's
No.
just there. Is that what
It-
you were getting at,
it-
sort of, or part of what you were
don't
asking?
know that your readers are aware, and so in your
It certainly makes sense to call people's attention to it. So in your list of things that you should know, like please go read what the heck is extensibility and extensions. You should also say, and by the way, here are some naming systems that are of particular interest in this community. Here's the URLs you must use for them. That's a perfectly legitimate thing to do, and to provide pointers into the HL7 specification to those things. So this is a brand new implementation guide pushed into GForge today. It's in the FHIR space. It is called IG-Guidance. And it contains a starting set of, I'm going to make this a little bit smaller. It contains some guidance on how to use the templates, including what the directory structure is and what all the different files are and what you put in each of them. It's not complete because I haven't got it done yet, but it will be complete and it will be updated as we continue to make changes to the templates. So if you're curious about what the heck are the rules today, this will be where you'll find it. This is also where you can propose changes to the documentation. And if you propose changes to the template, we will ask you to make a pull request against this as well, to propose updates to the documentation that correspond. And this is also where I have stuck the Lloyd's list of good practices that will hopefully over time turn into HL7's list of good practices. So take a look, read, and join the discussion on IG creation around other stuff you think should be there, stuff that you think is controversial and Lloyd's out to lunch, because sometimes I am. It's been known to happen. And then, so the link to this, so this is on build.fire.org/IG/IG-guidance. And I will put a link to this in the sample IG implementation guide so that you can find it from there, and I'll put a link to the sample IG in here so you can find it either way. And I will also formally announce this on the IG authors discussion forum on chat.fire.org once it's a little bit more complete. And yeah, so this is a resource that will be available to you and that I will look forward to your feedback on. But the notion is eventually this implementation guide will document the templates, but this implementation guide will also eat its own dog food in that it will use the template, and it will use the template to do all sorts of weird, wild, and funky things, so that when you encounter a need to do something particularly weird and wild, there will hopefully be an example of that here, so you can see, oh, that's how you do that weird thing in Markdown, because this list of good practices in IGs is in Markdown, and it took me 20 minutes to figure out how to make bulleted lists work in Markdown, because I'm not a Markdown person, and I still managed to mess it up somewhat, I saw, so I'll fix that. But the notion is that if you want to do things like have a floating picture on the right-hand side, or you want to mix and match numbered lists and bulleted lists, or you want to have all of the other weird and wild things that people know are theoretically possible in HTML, but aren't sure how to make it work properly, that we will provide examples of those things here, so with explanation, so that you can then use this as a resource. And by the same token, if you are creating an IG and you spend a day and a half figuring out how to make something work and you do something cool in your IG, please make a pull request to add that into this documentation so that other people can see how to do it too. Any questions on that before we move into our final session of let's go off and create implementation guides?
So when you said for naming system, we should use the URI instead of a void. Is that true for value set as well? Because I'm thinking for ECQMs, because all the value sets are reside in VSAC and it's using void. Is that going to cause issues? If going.
I would love it if VSAC defined standard URIs for all of their value sets that ideally resolved to an appropriate page in the VSAC website, because that would make life so easy for implementers. But my personal take is that particular horse has already left the barn, because there's lots of people who are referencing VSAC value sets by their OID URNs, and I'm not sure that we can change it at this point. I'm happy for the community to tell me I'm wrong, and I'm happy for VSAC to say you're right. Having meaningful URIs would be better, and we're going to go that route, but I don't know that that's possible at this point.
The conversations with VSAC are ongoing. Did we talk about, you had a page you were looking at just before about profiling, and you mentioned extensions.
I did.
Did you talk about extensions?
I didn't. I didn't talk about a whole lot of things.
I'm going to Skype you a link. Just wanted to show people. So if you look at your log, you'll see briefly in your log sending usage stats to server. So they go off to a server, and then here's where they end up, which is a URL that you can look at. So if you want to make that a little bit bigger, Lloyd, and then look at the resource, view by resource type, and then just choose address. So this is all the extensions that have been used on address by all the implementation guides that have run through your IG publisher in the last 6 months. So you can see what other people are doing with extensions, and they're all there by type, so you can look at them all. So if you're going to put an extension on address because someone tells you it's a good idea, the first thing you should always do is say, no, it's not a good idea. But when you lose that argument, then you should go and look at this and say, what are actually people doing? And one of the reasons is the committees to maintain an eye on this to see what they might consider elevating up to the spec, or if there's anybody they should talk to who clearly doesn't have a clue what's going on, which is also sometimes evident. But as an IG author, you could be looking for, here's an extension that already does what I'm doing. So I Skyped it to Lloyd.
That's all that's necessary. Lloyd will tell us after. He can put it into his.
I could, or Graham could.
We put it in. I got it out of Julep. Right. I'll put it in Julep again.
Yeah. I will add this into the list of things that you should consider when you're looking at creating extensions in the best practices. Yes. Any other discussion around best practices? Excellent. So, yes.
The way way to provide feedback on an IG is still with a link at the bottom, right?
Yes. This IG has that same link. It doesn't yet exist as an IG in our list of IGs. I could certainly add it there, and will do so when somebody reminds me. I mean, this particular one, I'm not sure that I want to start receiving change requests on this. I'd much rather see discussion on Zulip around this. This is not a formal artifact that I really expect to see balloted. This is more a resource for HL7 internal use, or community use. I mean, it may be relevant to folks outside of HL7, but realistically, we will figure out what the best way is to track these things. My gut is discussion on Zulip and formal requests through GitHub.
I was thinking of the, so what we have in IHE, the, when something is on public comment, then we have, well, I was actually imagining that an IG could look somewhat differently or have different sets of input if you're in public comment state or if you're in final text state. Just thinking out loud.
Sure.
Then the link would exist or not, or the link is always there, right? The link to provide feedback.
The link to provide feedback is always there because we always want feedback. I mean, in theory, we could change the IG so that when it's under ballot, it tells you that, hey, by the way, this is under ballot. Here's where you go find the ballot version of it, or formal review or whatever. But yeah, we always want to be able to gather feedback until such time as we deprecate it.
Okay, thanks.